This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30.
Can I welcome all members joining us remotely this afternoon are Pádraig Delargy, Emma Sheeran, Pat Sheehan and Christopher Stolfert. I'm sure other members may arrive later on. Can I advise members that the committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online. Members are welcome to use their mobile devices as long as they're in airplane mode and all devices are muted. So can I move into item 1 of business and apologies? We've received 2 apologies, one from Trevor Lunn and the other from Alex Easton. Do members have any other apologies they'd like to share? Okay.
Chair.
Yes.
I want to apologise. I need to leave at 2:45.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pat.
Thanks.
Okay, Chair's business item number 2. Members, the planned meeting of the International Parliamentary Forum in the House of Lords on last Friday, December 2021, was cancelled. It was just, I got the news of it as I was about to leave to go to the airport, so thank goodness for that. I think just the new precautions in and around Parliamentary building, Westminster and that, necessitated just a change of plans rather than inviting outside people into Westminster for business. So I'm sure it will have an update and it will be back again to discuss the business in the House of Lords. Item number 3 is the draft minutes. Members, the draft minutes of the meeting held on the 8th of December are at pages 6 to 13 of the meeting pack. If members are content with the minutes as a true reflection of the proceedings, I'm happy to sign them. Are members happy? Okay. Item number 4 of business is matters arising. Members, there is a summary of the main issues that were raised by the stakeholder groups in relation to the refugee integration strategy. The summary is on pages 15 to 17 of the meeting pack. If members are happy with the content of that summary, and I think it was a very comprehensive summation of what we were told, and if they're happy with that, are you happy that I forward the notes to the consultation team within the Executive Office? Yeah, okay. Members, the proposed extended list of stakeholders groups to give evidence to the committee in relation to the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy are on pages 18 to 19 of the pack. Emma, last week you suggested a few other stakeholder groups and I had suggested a few as well. So there's an extensive list there now. There probably could be others that we've left out because we really have to try and get as much diversity into that group as possible in terms of engagement. But can I refer members to pages 3 to 69 of the table pack 2, which combines the consultation paper for the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy and the Domestic and Sexual Violence and Abuse strategy, which is open to consultation from the 10th of January and closes on the 7th of March. I think if I can suggest to members as maybe to complement and support that consultation, that we may wish to have a separate event to consider this evidence rather than holding a stakeholder event on the same day that we're actually getting a submission and a breakdown from the department. We could maybe have a separate event where we gather evidence. So if members were in agreement, we could hold that separate event, perhaps some Thursday in February. And it would be, a dedicated, almost like a conference, bringing all of the stakeholders together, maybe posing a few questions in separate, digitally obviously, separate rooms, and then come back and report back to the committee. I think it would be a comprehensive micro-inquiry that would feed into the open consultation as it opens in January. If members were happy with that type of format, we might just process that and give the okay to the team to go and organise that. Any members would like to comment on that? No? Happy with action? Okay. And then the other thing that I would like to ask members, do you think it would be productive if we were to invite the Health and Justice Committee to that event as well? So there could be, wider consultation than just our own committee, but with the other 2 committees that have an interest in this.
Chair, could I come in there, please?
Yeah.
I mean, in principle, I would have no difficulty with that. I would welcome it. In fact, But I think logistically, the problem of bringing those all three committees together would be very difficult. I mean, we've been trying in the Education Committee for a long time to get a joint session with the Health Committee, and it was almost impossible. So things may be different after Christmas, but I'm just flagging that up as a potential problem. Thanks.
Pat, and I agree with you, because logistically it may be difficult. It would be all virtual. We would be organising it virtually, but my concern perhaps with the two committees in question is the fact that they will be in the midst of a very heavy legislative process within their own committees. And I wouldn't want it to hold it back, because I think the outcomes will probably be the same, because the most important part of this is the actual engagement with the stakeholders and feeding that back into the consultation process. So if you're happy, for us to move ahead in that manner, I think, the principle and the content is not affected by if there's one committee there or three committees there.
Yeah. No, I'm happy enough with that, Chair.
Yeah, okay. We'll proceed then. Okay. So item number 5 is the dedicated mechanism, and we are going to have an oral briefing from the Human Rights Commission, the Equality Commission, the Irish Human Rights and the Equality Commission oral briefing. Okay, members, the papers are in your meeting pack on pages 20 to 54. And can I welcome to the meeting Miss Alison Kilpatrick, Chief Commissioner, Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, Miss Geraldine McGahey, Chief Commissioner, Equality Commission for Northern Ireland, and Miss Sinead Gibney, Chief Commissioner, Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. Can I advise you that this session is not being recorded by Hansard, and the video of the meeting will be available on the committee webpage. And can I remind just members that we do understand the limitations of resources and the need to prioritise legislation in relation to Hansard, but concerns have been raised, and rightly so, about the lack of an official report as it has implications on transparency. And again, members, just to be sure, we have raised these concerns with senior management and we are seeking a resolution to this particular issue. So good afternoon to all witnesses, and can I say a very big congratulations to Alison for taking up her post as Chief Commissioner. I think they're in September, and I welcome her to the first briefing of this committee, and I'm sure there'll be many others coming. So can I invite Alison, Geraldine and Sinead to brief our committee. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair and colleagues. Thank you very much for that warm welcome. I'm going to begin, if I may, just by making some brief opening remarks. Then I'll pass you to Geraldine McGahey, Chief Commissioner, Equality Commission, and Sinead Gibney, Chief Commissioner, Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. She will finish. We've tried to coordinate what we have to say to you to try and make best use of time and allow plenty of room for questions. A lot of the issues that I suspect you'll be interested in are quite technical and detailed, therefore it's simply not possible to summarise them, but we have a few key messages we would like to share with you. And one is that we've been working very closely together and very much welcome the chance to appear together today, and we appreciate your invitation to us to do so. So if I can begin by stressing how important it is that if effective use is to be made of Article 2 of the Protocol in protecting the rights of everyone in Northern Ireland, it's critical in our view that the community is aware of those rights, that people do actually raise issues of practical import, and that they know where to go if they believe their rights have been breached. It's difficult so far to get sort of real practical traction in relation to Article 2, and I think it's because maybe awareness raising hasn't been as successful as it might have been. We've been working on a communications campaign to try and better raise that awareness, and that we hope to roll out in early 2022. So the commissions undertake our own research and we identify and respond to issues, but we depend very heavily on the community telling us about what's happening on the ground. And it's for that reason, as well as others I'll come on to, that we particularly welcome the attention being given to the issues by this committee and your round of public engagements. In our view, the greater the public awareness, the greater our effectiveness. We have run a series of events so far, and if I just give you a flavour of some of those since the previous session, we are hoping to run more in the new year. But in particular, we have been having roundtables in relation to access to health, immigration, frontier workers, etc. And we are developing a position paper developed with the Equality Commission on the scope of Article 2 and the impact in particular on access to healthcare, particularly for border communities, frontier workers, and in relation to all island services. Those are the questions that are being asked probably most routinely of the Human Rights Commission. So we hope to be able to put something into the public domain and share with you as a committee in the very near future. We've had several meetings with the Human Rights Consortium, the Equality Commission and the Unite Committee, Irish Congress Trade Union, and that's also informed our work. We're responsible as a dedicated mechanism for scrutinising legislation for compliance with Article 2, and a recent example of that was our advice on the Nationality and Borders Bill, which was concluded its stages in the House of Commons. We raised a number of issues in relation to that bill, including in particular its disapplication of domestic legislation deriving from the EU Trafficking Directive. So we've made our submissions and we'll be keeping a close eye on in relation to that. We're continuing to consider a number of related issues impacting on the common travel area, including the risk of increased racial profiling and electronic travel authorisations. And those issues have also been brought to our attention recently by the Committee on the Administration of Justice. And what I can say, in all honesty, is that we haven't yet reached a concluded position, but we're actively working on it, and we're certainly aware of and concerned about the potential issues. We think effective and timely advice on all of these issues depends on us being given relevant information and notice of impending amendments. And we have formal channels to share information, and we intend to exploit them to their absolute maximum. But we also hope to establish informal channels, and perhaps through committee staff, we can develop those. We all, I think, need to know what each is doing. We're already stretched to capacity, so the more notice we get to work on drafts, the better. And that's a message we have urged on the EU as well. So we would invite the committee to remind the Executive Office of the need for structured, transparent, regular engagement, not just with the UK and EU, but also with civil society and the three commissions, and that we let each other know of developments. Alongside the public engagement, we will be focusing on getting Article 2 properly embedded into legislative and policy development. And the committees obviously play a key part in that, and by always asking what consideration has been given to Article 2 in relevant bills and consultations, and we've been doing the same. And it's not always obvious. Sometimes you need to look twice at a bill or a consultation to see that Article 2 actually is engaged. We have referenced Article 2 so far in our responses to the Parental Bereavement Bill, Justice, Sexual Offences and Trafficking Bill, Autism Bill, and also in development of the new Decade New Approach Equality strategies. And since the last session, we've had a number of successful engagements, including with the EU, and they've promised us early notice of EU policy and legislative developments, particularly those that will impact on the 6 equality directives at Annex 1 of the protocol. We have pressed on the issue of the supply of medicines and welcome the EU's statement that it's committed to ensuring long-term uninterrupted medicine supply to Northern Ireland, and hope the matter can be swiftly resolved. We've continued our monthly engagements with NIO and Executive Office, discussing implementation, in particular of Article 2, and trying to help build capacity within departments and work on, as I say, communication between us all. We've undertaken a review of delays in the EU settlement scheme, and that was as a result of a number of complaints of applications being delayed for reasons which appear at best to be irrational. These delays are having a significant impact on access to healthcare, housing, employment and some benefits. We've raised this with the Independent Monitoring Authority, with whom we meet regularly. Another issue raised was it was in respect to the civil service nationality requirements, and following legal advice, we didn't identify a breach of Article 2, but we did identify a number of issues requiring clarification, and wrote to the Secretary of State to obtain that clarification. An issue brought to our attention, which may be of some interest, is also in relation to fishing, in particular boats in Donegal, but fishing in NI waters. They must now register their boats in Northern Ireland, but Irish law limits the time they can land their catch. And this is, we think, potentially a breach of Article 2, but also rights under the European Convention of Human Rights, and we're engaging with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission on that. So I've rattled through rather quickly. Geraldine and Sinead are going to deal with some of those the issues that I've touched on, maybe deal with them in more scope. But before I finish, I can't not mention the statement yesterday about replacement of the Human Rights Act. We are very concerned that it will undermine not only our core work and our ability to make human rights effective for everyone, it will undermine the effectiveness of Article 2 of the Protocol. And when that's coupled with suspension of the NI Bill of Rights, we worry that the very notion of human rights may be under attack. This will also have a direct impact on the legal framework on legacy, and that's also an issue which clearly has been pushed to the forefront again today in relation to public engagement. That's going to require some very serious consideration by the Commission when we receive the draft proposals. We have to study and understand the judgment of the Supreme Court today, but we fear that we're doing a lot of this work now with the backdrop of an attack on the Human Rights Act itself, which of course is what enables us to take action and enforce rights directly in our local courts. So having rattled through that maybe a little bit too quickly, I'll pass on to Geraldine McGahey, who is going to be able to brief you in relation to a lot of other issues, and some of those I touched on.
Thanks, Alison, and good afternoon, members. And like Alison, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here before you today to give you an update on the work that we have been progressing since we last briefed you. And I suppose as we approach the end of our first year in our new roles and responsibilities, it's really very fitting that we're here today to give you this update. I'd like to stress that the three commissions have been working very well together. We've been working in close partnership with good cooperation and information sharing. The Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission and ourselves have been working effectively to fulfil our duties and exercise our powers robustly, including holding government to account and raising awareness of the importance of Article 2 with key stakeholders. Many of the engagements that we undertake do that jointly. But my update, as Alison has said, will focus really on the work that the Equality Commission has been leading on, as well as some of the key issues that we have highlighted jointly to government. So in respect of the Equality Commission and our dedicated mechanism unit, you will be well aware that the scope of Article 2 is a considerable task in terms of scoping out the legislation that is covered, and we're working jointly on this. Specifically, the Equality Commission has made considerable progress in mapping out EU law that may fall within scope of Article 2 in terms of the non-regression commitment and the associated underpinning domestic legislation. We'll be engaging more widely on that with stakeholders in the new year, including with yourselves. And similarly, extensive work is being undertaken on tracking and monitoring EU law, and similarly draft GB and Northern Ireland legislation checking for compliance with Article 2. The Equality Commission has received some inquiries, but the volume is currently low, and that was to be expected due to the fact that this is a new area of law, and also that up until the 31st of December in 2020, EU law and UK law were broadly aligned. So inquiries are indeed likely to increase as we start seeing divergence of rights post-Brexit. But to give you a flavour of some of the issues that we've been highlighting with the UK government and relevant Westminster committees, one of them more recently has been issues impacting on the Jewish and the Muslim communities in terms of their access to kosher and halal meat and food products. The commissions have raised concerns with the House of Lords Committee and with the Secretary of State. Similarly, we've been raising concerns in respect of voting rights, and the UK government are well aware of these now and are taking them into consideration, and we await further developments in that regard. The issue of assistance dogs we've talked to you about before, and we continue to raise this matter. We note negotiations are ongoing, but we would continue to call on both the UK government and the EU to resolve this issue sooner rather than later. We would thank the committee for its letter way back in June on the proposed Pay Transparency Directive and how it might be applicable to Northern Ireland within the scope of Article 2. And whilst we issued an initial response to that at the end of June, we do apologise for the fact that you haven't had a comprehensive response to it. It is a complex issue that's still under consideration by the commissions, And we have received legal advice on the matter, which is currently under review, and we hope to be able to respond to you very shortly with a full and detailed response. Alison has touched on the need to raise awareness in our communication strategies. And as she has said, the work that we do is very much directed by our engagement with communities and stakeholders. To that end, it is a key objective of ours. We have developed accessible publications, and we've recently commissioned a radio advertising campaign to raise awareness of public rights, and hopefully you have actually heard of those on local radio. We continue our engagement with the Executive Office on circulation of information on Article 2 internally within the civil service. Research is really important to our work, both in terms of developing our policy positions and informing other stakeholders. And one of the issues that has been receiving considerable attention is the loss of EU funding. And to that end, we have commissioned research about the potential impact of the loss of this funding on Section 75 groups. I have to say it is a real significant concern across all of the Section 75 groups, including disability groups and disabled people. We have also been undertaking a vital piece of research in terms of legislative scrutiny of Article 2 commitments. We have been progressing this on behalf of the three commissions, specifically examining the parliamentary and assembly mechanisms required to ensure that there is indeed effective scrutiny of the Article 2 commitment. And this project is now complete. We're considering the final recommendations that are being brought forward, and we will consult with you in more detail on that in due course. But critically, the report has highlighted the important and the very key role that this committee and other Assembly committees have in terms of scrutinising draft legislation to ensure that Northern Ireland legislation does not breach Article 2 obligations. And central to this role is the necessity for explanatory memorandums for any new legislative measures, including Northern Ireland and UK-wide measures, to make clear what consideration has been given to ensuring conformity with the Article 2 commitment in the drafting of the proposed legislation. We raised this issue with the House of Lords Committee on the Protocol, and following our evidence, they actually raised the matter with government, and recent from government indicate that they are indeed considering this matter. And we'd like to take this opportunity to ask this committee to raise the matter also. We believe that introducing this change will assist you and other committees in their scrutiny of draft legislation. We have also been undertaking joint research on behalf of the three commissions on the divergence of rights. It's an important piece of research. It's designed to capture how equality and human rights and best practice might diverge across the island of Ireland. In terms of engagement with key stakeholders, including equality and human rights organisations, this has greatly informed our work as stakeholders raise issues of concerns with us, and our engagement has included providing evidence to the House of Lords Subcommittee on the Protocol, on the EU proposals and the UK command paper. We stressed during that evidence giving that there should be no weakening of Article 2 and that the Article 2 oversight mechanisms were vital. We also stressed the need for the Northern Ireland Executive and UK Government to have ongoing regular engagement with equality and human rights stakeholders, including on cross-border issues. Recently, we took part in the Human Rights Festival and we held a disability event. It was a joint event between Alison and myself, where we heard from representatives of the disability sector, basically to hear what their concerns were. And similarly, we've been engaging with women's sector to hear and highlight to them the role of the dedicated mechanism, and more importantly, to hear their views. So I hope that gives you a bit of a flavour of the work that we have been progressing as the Equality Commission in partnership with the others. And I'm going to hand over to Sinead now to provide an update on the joint work of the three commissions. Over to you, Sinead. Thank you.
Thanks, Geraldine, and thank you to Ali and Geraldine, and of course to the Executive Office Committee for the invitation to be here today. As you've heard, I'm going to concentrate on the work undertaken by our three commissions together. The All-Ireland Working Group of the dedicated mechanism, which deals with any arising issues that have an all-Ireland dimension, has met 4 times over the course of this year, including one in-person meeting for full commissions, for all of the full commissions. And the working group has been an important way for the 3 commissions to consider together the broader work of the dedicated mechanism, and for the organisation that I represent, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, to stay effectively connected as the issues unfold and the work begins in earnest by our 2 colleagues in the North. The 3 commissions met in person in Ballymascanlon 3 weeks ago to discuss the areas of concern for the dedicated mechanism which have that all-Ireland dimension, with the broader membership than just those who sit on the working group. We heard the details coming through from research that Alison and Geraldine have just updated you on, and we discussed the important strategic direction of the work of the dedicated mechanism, including around communication and stakeholder engagement. It was a really fruitful meeting and discussion, and we had input from both Minister Simon Coveney and Minister of State Conor Burns, and I'd like to share some quotes from their inputs with you now. From Minister Coveney, we very much welcome the commitments that were made and the legislation brought in by the UK government to implement them. The dedicated mechanism, with the Human Rights and Equality Commissions at its centre, will ensure that confidence and stability is maintained. And from Minister of State Conor Burns, who was referencing at the beginning the ongoing protocol negotiations, I just want to state really, really clearly that those discussions are about trade. They're about the frictionless movement of goods at our border. They in no way relate to the United Kingdom's unshakable commitment to our obligations under Article 2 of the Protocol. We remain proud of our record on rights, proud of the role that we take in working in partnership on an all-Ireland basis with the 3 bodies represented at your meeting today. So as you can hear, it's clear that from both the UK and Irish governments that there is a respect for the importance of the dedicated mechanism and the work being done by our organisations. An example of that work that Geraldine just referenced and which we're undertaking as 3 commissions is the current legal research that we've tendered for on the divergence of rights. We're looking at EU law and case law from the European Court of Justice as well as best practice. And this is, of course, a crucial component of that commitment to non-diminution of rights. We held a cross-border event in May with a range of public bodies and civil society organisations from the Armagh Monaghan area. And we have another event in preparation for February of next year, which we hope will take place in the Northwest area. And we see these events as a crucial means of staying connected to civil society and keeping groups and communities informed of what we're doing. Personally, I found it incredibly helpful to hear directly from community groups on both sides of the border who shared their perspectives on the changes that had already come about and those that they anticipate. As you've clearly heard, we're working really well together, as our organisations historically have done, to deal with this latest set of human rights and equality challenges presenting themselves in the wake of Brexit, and to support each other in discharging our mandates to protect and promote human rights and equality for everyone on the island of Ireland. That concludes our opening remarks, and we're happy now to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the 3 commissioners for their overview and brief. And I suppose probably the common theme that we are hearing from each of the commissioners is about communication and stakeholder engagement and the importance of that in ensuring that the work that they do is thorough and complete. I would like to ask just a really practical question here at the outset. You know, are there any plans to have a single point of contact for all the 3 commissioners on matters in relation to this dedicated mechanism? I suppose I could ask you, Sinead.
I think actually we're happy to work very collaboratively together, Chair. We've as I said, met now in person as 3, but we've also done a series of appearances, if you like, or engagements, including this committee. So no, I don't think there's necessarily a need to do so. I think it helps to keep us all informed. So I think keeping the 3 organisations and us as heads of those organisations as points of contact probably is the best way we would like to go forward.
Okay, another question, and I suppose I'm going to direct this to Alison as she raised it in her part of the brief, is I'm really concerned about the potential or impact on the Nationality and Borders Bill on human rights here. Specifically, I would like to find what her view is on the issue for the need for electronic travel authorisations for EU 26 citizens, and how does she believe that this will impact on people here who have settled status, and will they have to carry papers to prove this? And I suppose, speaking from an MLA from a border area, what are the implications for EU 26 citizens who live in Donegal and travel to Derry every day to work? I myself have been contacted by the Committee on the Administration of Justice, which suggests that the Nationality and Borders Bill is potentially in breach of Articles 1, 2 and 3 of the Protocol. And at this early point, what are your views on that? And will you be working on trying to dig down deep into the implications to our citizens?
That's I'll try and respond as briefly as possible. That is quite a big question with lots of different bits to it, that each one of them are quite complicated. I'm more than happy to share with the committee some of the work we've done on this, the analysis, written analysis. But certainly the Nationality and Borders Bill deals with nationality, asylum and immigration, and it's clause 71, which I suspect is the one which will have the greatest impact. And that's the introduction of the new electronic travel authorization scheme. So individuals, the way it works is that individuals who do not need a visa, entry clearance or other specified immigration status will need to obtain a valid authorization before travelling to the UK. And that primarily will impact on non-Irish EU nationals living across the border. But we can't be certain yet that it will be, it shouldn't be limited, we should be concerned if it's limited to anybody, but we can't be certain yet that it will only be limited to them. And I know Stephen Farry raised an amendment, co-sponsored an amendment that would have allowed travel across the island of Ireland for non-British and non-Irish nationals without checks. That was not selected for a vote. As I understand it, you may know more, and the bills will be debated in the new year. So we're watching very closely, but you're quite right that there are a number of concerns. It does also, as soon as you introduce any checks, any additional pieces of paper, you increase the risk of racial profiling and other profiling, which is singularly unhelpful. And with it was supposed to have an open border, that certainly is a barrier to that. Little account, it would seem to us, has been taken of the common travel area arrangements, and very little specifically has been mentioned about them. But it does leave open the possibility that British and Irish citizens may be required to carry passports when entering the UK across the land border as proof of nationality in lieu of a travel authorisation. What it may also limit is the ability of migrants who cross the Irish border to work or access services. So we are concerned. We're working very closely on it. We have written seeking clarification in relation to a number of issues, and certainly have identified a potential engagement of Article 2. And I think all I can say really at this stage, without entering into speculation or saying more than I should, is that we are proceeding and pursuing this with both governments and also with the Assembly, and we will be able to report back to you in due course. But more than happy to send through to the committee the written paper we have in relation to some of this.
Alison, that would be really appreciated, because I think we're all just really trying to come to terms with what it actually means and the impact that it will have on the freedom of movement within the island of all of our citizens and all of our people. In relation, I'm just going to come back just on something that you said about the common travel area as well. That remains a concern because it's not underpinned by legislation. Do you believe that the rights that are contained within the CTA, or well, the rights that are not actually tied down within the CTA should be tied down in relation to legislation being put around it by the Irish government and by the UK government?
Well, I think probably my legal background would insist that I say yes, it should be written down so that people, and it's not just so that you can't resolve from it at a future time, although at the minute the CTA could be resolved from at a future time without too much difficulty. It's that people who have rights under it can go and look those rights up and read what the rights are and know how to enforce them. At the minute, it is a promise, but that's rarely good enough for those of us who are worried about legal rights to travel. And the CTA certainly isn't set in stone. So I think firming up of that in legislation would be the way forward, or in some recognised agreed document that people could actually rely on, take to a court if necessary.
Yeah, it's something that I'm really concerned of, and again, I would agree with your concerns in relation to the statement yesterday on the attack, really, on human rights, and it's something that we'll have to be monitoring closely to see what's happening. So I'm going to open this up to the other members, and can I bring Pat Sheehan into the spotlight, please?
Thanks, Sinead, and thanks to the contributors today. A question for Alison in relation to some of the points you made. You've identified or you're investigating potential breaches of Article 2, and we have been, these issues have also been flagged up by CAJ, such as civil service, nationality rules, the lost EU rights for Irish citizens born in the North, and the EU settlement scheme cut-off date. And I'm just wondering if there has been any response from the British government in terms of finding a remedy for these difficulties. Thanks.
Yes, CAJ have raised the issues, and we work closely with CAJ to see what we can work closely with them on exploring it. The short answer is no, there hasn't really been a satisfactory response. We are going to be addressing that in our scope paper, which is coming out hopefully in January, early January. We're going to be looking at the scope of Article 2 and all the potential breaches, and we'll be engaging independent legal advice in relation to that as well. So I'm hoping it won't be long before I can give you a much more definitive answer, but we haven't had a lot back from the British government.
Thanks for that. That's the answer I was expecting anyway. And recently, just moving on to another issue, recently the British government have confirmed that non-Irish EU citizens who moved to the North post-Brexit won't be able to vote in local government and assembly elections, but those who were here before Brexit will retain their vote. Would this be considered in any way a diminution of rights? I mean, it will certainly create two tiers of non-Irish EU citizens in the North. How would you respond to that? Yeah,
that we are looking at that, precisely that point. And it seems to me, although I'm just speaking now as Chief Commissioner, not the whole Commission, it seems to me that Article 2 is undoubtedly engaged in that issue. Whether or not it's a breach of Article 2 is really quite complicated. But what it flags up, and one of the reasons why we want to go first to the scope paper, is that Article 2 is actually relatively limited and narrow in its application. It's not going to be the remedy to protect all the rights that we had before Brexit. It just doesn't do enough to protect all of those rights. So I don't know if Geraldine wants to say a little bit more. I think they've also got some legal advice in relation to this issue, but this is another issue we hope to be able to give a definitive answer on probably in January. But I think the disappointing fact that it has flagged up for us is that Article 2 is very narrow and it is very limited. And I think we're going to be finding that more and more.
Okay.
Yeah, if I may just add to that, this is a matter that we have raised with the Secretary of State in relation to not just voting but also candidacy rights. And we did get an assurance that it wouldn't impact on those who were settled here before the end of the transition period. But we have highlighted the very fact, as you have raised, Pat, in relation to those who would move into Northern Ireland after that transition period. And we've raised it with the Northern Ireland office and with the Secretary of State. And we're awaiting further details. The liaison and the communication is continuing. But we're very aware that there is potentially an impact that will have an Article 2 implication. So we're continuing to raise that issue, and we're waiting to see how that will pan out in terms of how the legislation will continue to be drafted. So we'll keep you appraised as we get more information on that, but rest assured it's something that we're continuing to work on.
Okay, and I look forward to hearing from you when there's more clarity around that issue. And just finally, Chair, I'm just wondering if any assurances have been received on funding for the dedicated mechanism past March 2023. Thanks.
Yeah, well, maybe if I just come in on that. We have, as you say, funding for 3 years guaranteed, but we also had a commitment in writing from the UK government to the House of Lords subcommittee. They raised the issue in correspondence to government after our oral presentation and our written submissions, seeking that there would be an assurance of continued funding. And the government responded to confirm that it was fully behind the work that the commissions are doing and would continue its funding. We wait to see how that pans out in terms of the actual budget that we get. But at this moment in time, we have to work on the basis that they have committed to continuing the funding.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay.
Chair, I wonder, may I just add one brief comment to what Geraldine has said in relation to funding?
Yes. Go ahead.
The funding for the dedicated mechanism, certainly in terms of the Human Rights Commission, is ring-fenced. But there, I think, has become a misconception that the Commission is flush with money when it comes to dedicated mechanism. It's not. It is working very much to capacity, and there's a lot more we could do if there was a greater funding, but we're more concerned probably in relation to our core funding. And we're having to really stretch and ask staff to work harder than I should have to ask them. So the dedicated mechanism is protected, at least ring-fenced for a short period of time, but we're not flush. And as the complexity of Article 2 in this work becomes more clear, we're having to do more and more work, and we're having to scrutinise all the legislation and policy. So I think that needs to be borne in mind. It may be protected for a period of time, but it's by no means a lot of money for discharging the work that we have to do.
So, Alison, you've indicated there that you could do other work if you had further funding. What type of other work?
Well, we're already having to choose how we use our time and resources and how we use staff. So we will not be able to respond to all consultations. We will not be able to advise on all suggested legislation in any sort of detail. We will obviously continue to discharge our statutory functions as best we can, but we're already having to sort of share resources between the dedicated mechanism and the core work, in the sense that we're asking people to stretch and share their experience and to help each other. And of course, the dedicated mechanism it's all about protecting rights, so no diminution, and also the Equality Directive rights. But what they're protecting is human rights, which is our core work. So the Article 2 analysis isn't of a great deal of use if you don't know what core human rights are and what human rights are being breached. And I suspect the same would apply to Geraldine and Sinead. The core work is what informs the dedicated mechanism work. So the more that is taken off our core work, the less we have in relation to dedicated mechanism. So we certainly, it's becoming more and more complicated. We're having to engage more and more research and legal advice. This is all stuff that's never arisen before, and most EU lawyers are very perplexed as well about how this is actually going to be enforced going into the future. So we would like to do a lot more and be an awful lot more helpful with committees such as yourself.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Can I bring Emma Sheeran into the spotlight, please?
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank at the outset Alison, Geraldine and Sinead for your presentation and the questions that you have answered already. And I suppose my initial question relates very closely to the conversation that you've just had around funding, and we have obviously learned over the course of the past week that due to the lack of funding from the British government for the Human Rights Commission, that the A grade from the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions has been withdrawn, or has been, I suppose, they've refused to reaccredit the Commission with that grading. And obviously, I would view that, and our party would view that as being totally unacceptable and a threat to the protection of rights in the North, which you've already alluded to. And I suppose from the British government perspective, coming hot on the heels of some of the announcements that we've had this week around the Bill of No Rights, this shows the same lack of respect for the work of the Commission, which obviously has been vital to the protection and advancement of human rights in the North since the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. It's totally in line with that contempt from the British government, and worryingly, the threats to roll back on rights and the Human Rights Act that they've announced that I've already alluded to. And the same sort of attitude of contempt for the Good Friday Agreement and full incorporation of the European Convention of Human Rights. So from our perspective, to starve an organisation like yourselves of the resources that you need to complete your work is an insult to the people of the North. And in the post-Brexit period, the Commission should be receiving extra funding. And I know I've made that point in previous presentations, particularly to yourself, Geraldine, around the work that needs to be carried out and the monitoring role as part of the dedicated mechanism under the protocol. So if the Human Rights Commission loses this A status, which it looks like you already have, there is likely to be a diminution of rights on this side of the border. And in the absence of a local Bill of Rights, the process for which has ground to a halt following the DUP's refusal to allow a Bill of Rights to focus on rights, this is even more concerning. So I wondered if you would go into more detail around the loss of this status affecting daily protection of human rights in the North for citizens here, and how this is going to affect your work as part of the dedicated mechanism.
Yes, thank you for that. We haven't lost it yet, but we haven't been reaccredited. It's a technical situation we're in. So we came up for reaccreditation in the last few months, and we haven't been reaccredited with A status. What that means is that decision will be deferred. So it would normally happen for another 5 years. We would be accredited with A status for 5 years, and they haven't been able to do that. They've deferred removing our status essentially until the end of the financial year, with recommendations that the UK government provide greater funding and actually allow us to do our core activities. And all the Commission would say is that we just want to get on and do the job that statute has given to us to do. We are an arm's length body and we're independent, and we take that independence very seriously. And what seems to be happening is that we are told what money we need rather than people listening to what we say we need to do our work effectively. And it's very difficult when you get into that territory then, because our job is to advise, but if our advice, even in relation to our own functions, isn't taken, then it does stymie, to say the least. We have an opportunity to improve the situation, but we don't have a great deal of time. So the reaccreditation will come in, I think it's June of 2022. We'll have to go back to the UN and say why it is that we can now discharge our functions when we had to say, unfortunately, those functions are limited. What it also, and maybe Sinead or Geraldine could say something about this, but the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission has been reaccredited recently, as has, for example, the English Human Rights and Equality Commission. And what that does is give speaking rights on an international stage. And it's that international stage that holds the UK government to account internationally. It's not just about people travelling across Europe or beyond and sharing information. It is actually a critical function. It means we will no longer have speaking rights potentially on that stage. And it also means Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission is the only commission in these islands that doesn't have A status. So that, in the context of everything else we've been talking about, does concern us greatly. We have tried to save money wherever we possibly can. And I don't think it'd be any surprise to you if I said if you look at the makeup of our commissioners, these are all very serious professional people with long experience in the public sector at running big organisations and managing public money. So when we say we don't have enough money, we would hope that our word would be taken, that we don't have enough money to discharge our function. So we're sort of in a limbo period at the minute. I'm not sure we can say very much more. We have undertaken to save, as I say, make every cut and saving we possibly can. But there's a limit to what we can do and still do our work.
Perhaps I can add some comments here, if I may, Chair.
Yes, of course you can, Sinead.
Thank you. Just to really, I suppose, offer our solidarity to the NIHRC at this moment. As Ali mentioned, the IREC has just recently been through the accreditation process, the re-accreditation process as well. And we were re-accredited as an A status organisation. And I cannot emphasise enough how important it is for a national human rights institution to have this, and what an anomaly it would be for the NIHRC to lose it. The NIHRC is, to give you the external perspective, a hugely respected leader in human rights within Europe and globally. And it would be really detrimental to the work of the organisation if that reaccreditation wasn't received. I think also the other concern that we would have is around the Joint Committee, and obviously the ability of the NIHRC to continue to engage with the Joint Committee of the NIHRC and IREC as established in the Good Friday Agreement. So really just to offer that solidarity and emphasise to you as another body that does have that A status the importance of this.
Thanks to you both. I just have one follow-up question, and it is around the reference that I made initially about the British government's threats to the Human Rights Act and introducing these proposals for what some amongst the human rights fraternity have referred to the British Bill of No Rights. And obviously this comes, the week after they have debated the so-called Borders Bill, which the discourse around that has been horrifying, and the attempts to dehumanise people and the way that the British government have looked upon people who are trying to escape awful conditions is, I suppose, indicative of their attitude towards rights. And I suppose the consequences of these threats to the Human Rights Act for human rights in the North and for the Good Friday Agreement and the implications of that. And it seems like there has been very little thought given towards the implications for the people of the North. So I wanted to get an understanding from yourselves around how confident you are that the government will actually uphold their commitment to Article 2 and the dedicated mechanism in the wake of Brexit.
Shall I go first in relation to the Human Rights Act? I think it's probably most appropriate to me. I'll say three things which I hope will answer your question. First is in relation to the European Convention on Human Rights. Article 3:13 is the right to an effective remedy. Now the UK government didn't incorporate Article 13. But what it did instead was enact the Human Rights Act, which was supposed to deliver Article 13 effective remedy for the United Kingdom. In the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, the commitment was to complete incorporation of the ECHR, and that is precisely what the Human Rights Act does. And I noticed the Lord Chancellor saying that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement didn't commit to the Human Rights Act. That's not quite right. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement committed to incorporation of the ECHR, and the only way you can incorporate the ECHR is to make it domestic law. And it doesn't matter whether it's called the Human Rights Act or a different act, it has to be an act of Parliament to do that, to bring rights into our local courts. So the disregard perhaps for that part of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement would give me cause for concern in relation to the other parts of the commitments on which we rely so heavily. And I would also say that Northern Ireland has probably benefited more than any other part of the UK or Ireland by the Human Rights Act. But what it certainly does not benefit from is a sort of misinformation or disinformation in relation to the Human Rights Act. So a lot of the examples that were given to justify the problem created by the Human Rights Act, I don't recognise them in reality or practice, and I certainly don't believe that the Human Rights Act created those issues. So it's very difficult. It will take the heart out of the Commission, because what we work with is real practical human rights for everybody, and that means enforcing them in local courts. And if we can't do that anymore and the public can't do that anymore, then human rights become fairly theoretical. And I think the last thing I would say is that this is also coupled with the Judicial Review in Courts Bill, which is seeking to limit access to judicial review. And most cases raising human rights issues are enforced in the courts through judicial review. So, and just judicial review being limited will remove the right to challenge removal of the Human Rights Act. So it really is becoming a vicious circle.
Yeah, maybe if I just add to that, the consultation has been launched, and we will review it in great detail and take on board the points that Ali has made. Words are very good, but it's the actions that follow behind them. And what I'm getting at is the fact that there are commitments that the government have made in terms of the Good Friday Agreement and the protection of rights in Northern Ireland, etc., etc. But it's in the detail that comes with that you'll see just how strong those words are and what they're backed up with. And at the moment, that's questionable. So I think we need to study it in a little bit more detail and have a very robust response to the consultation period. Because at the end of the day, if we can't protect rights in Northern Ireland, then what is the point in Article 2, commitments, etc., etc.? So I think we should sort of hold our water on that and study the paper in detail. But I would endorse what Alison has said so far.
There is one last, sorry to come back to me again, point I should have made actually, which is also of some significance, reminded by what Sinead said about A status. In Ireland, there is the similar legislation. They have their own Human Rights Act. So if we no longer have it north of the border, but in Ireland they do have it, we're going to have this huge divergence again in rights across the island. And that shouldn't be forgotten, and that's going to affect a lot of people who will be crossing a border regularly, crossing into the different jurisdictions.
Thank you all. Chair, I don't have any more questions. I think the answers from the presenters are all consistent with that this is a worrying time for rights, and the dialogue and discourse around it is frustrating and worrying, and anybody interested in human rights would probably be of the same view. Thanks a million to you all.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Emma. And can I bring Padraig Delargy into the spotlight, please?
Sinead, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Padraig.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties, so just wanted to start off by that. Thank you all for your presentation so far. I suppose, just to start off, really, there were two questions that I had. The first one just was around, you had outlined the need for agreement on the supply of medicines to ensure that people, particularly people with disabilities, are not disadvantaged. And Sefcovic had signals that the EU wanted an agreement on medicines and are willing to change their own laws, I suppose, unilaterally to achieve this. So does it concern you then that we aren't seeing more progress on the British side?
Geraldine might be, I think, is taking the lead. Are you in relation to medicines?
No, I think it was you, Alison.
Is it me again? I thought you might be tired of hearing my voice. Yes, we're very hopeful that there is quite an easy solution to this if there's a will. And it's not just about accessing over-the-counter medicine or having a pharmacy well stocked. It goes to people's ability to live their lives with decency who rely on medicine. Some people rely on medicine simply to be able to get up and walk around. So it's absolutely critical that this is sorted. And we're hearing positive noises, but we don't have a solution just yet. We are continuing to press quite firmly, and we'll certainly take back your concern.
Okay, thanks for that. I just had another question then around ETAs. So it was just around whether or not the IHREC had begun any investigations or having engaged with the British government on their plans to introduce the electronic travel authorization, particularly for non-Irish EU citizens who live in the south and travel into the north, as a potential breach of Article 2. To me, it's a disgraceful decision, and I don't consider the daily. To me, it doesn't consider the daily reality. Of life in border counties, particularly, as someone who I live on the border myself, and somebody who lives in Muff and Bridgend and Calais, who goes to shops, goes to work, goes to school in Derry, would need pre-travel permission. It also has, I suppose, a worrying reality that it's likely to increase racial profiling, and this policy creates a hard border for non-Irish EU citizens. Would you agree with that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Thanks for your question. We haven't yet taken any action. We are, as Ali referenced earlier, similar to our colleagues in the NIHRC and ECNI, we're looking at this issue at the moment. We always anticipated that one of the first groups who would be impacted, and certainly in the case of any checks being introduced, as these would be non-Irish citizens in the south that are looking to cross the border on a daily basis. I mean, it's just the precarity of their situation within what we know to be the common travel area, and Ali again referenced this earlier. And obviously we did a bit of work on this as the Joint Committee back in 2018, 2019. We published a piece on that calling for that greater certainty around the common travel area. So it's not something we have taken action on. It's something we're monitoring very closely, as we are the concerns around racial profiling as well.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for that. That's me, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Pádraig, we have no other members that have raised their hands to say that they want to ask any questions. Maybe they might, because Pádraig had difficulty using the raise hand icon. If any other member wants to ask a question, can they please come into the spotlight now? Right, okay, it's fine. Well, thank you very much for that. There's one small question that I want to ask, just for my own clarification. How will the commissioners, how will they look at the EU legislation and the changes that may come about, and how, in terms of how relevant they are to Northern Ireland, and how will they track them? Who is going to be doing the tracking? Is it the EU, or is it the UK government? Is it the Executive Office? Just whose responsibility is it to track the changes to EU legislation? I find it all just a very, very confusing at the minute in terms of responsibility.
Can I maybe just come in on this to start with, and then if my colleagues want to join in, then that's fine. It's an issue that we have been raising through government and with the EU. The EU have indicated that they are considering establishing a website whereby they will give advance notice of proposals to amend legislation or to enable tracking of legislation. It's something that we have been asking the EU to address, similarly with both the Assembly and the UK Government of Westminster, in terms of assisting us and giving us much notice in advance to enable all three commissions to review that legislation and to have an input into it. It is a mammoth task to track legislation, but that work has commenced. We are building both formal and informal networks to try to gain that information and enable us to have an input at the earliest possible stage. But we have flagged it up with both the EU and the UK government to work with us to establish formal communication channels to allow this to happen. It has been raised through NIO and with the co-chair of the joint working group at a recent meeting whereby officers had asked very clearly that such a process would be put in place to enable that kind of liaison to happen at a very early stage, because as you can see from the amount of conversation this afternoon, there are certain aspects that will pass through without any great problem. And then there are others that will have quite significant impact. And we need to have as much time as possible to be able to consider those, have discussions with the likes of yourselves and other stakeholders to garner all of the information that's needed to be fed into the whole process to enable the UK government to meet its requirements in terms of its commitment that it's given in terms of keeping pace and non-regression. So anything that you can do as a committee to encourage other committees within the Assembly to work with us and civil servants, that would be most welcome.
Jerry, my fear is that there will be an awful lot of, replication of work. If everybody if it's everybody's job but nobody's job, then too many people are actually trying to do the one thing, and we just need some type of framework around this so that we know who's tracking what, and then signalling and signposting then the relevant department or bodies or organisations or arm's length bodies such as yourselves to actually do the scoping exercises in it. It's it's completely not productive for multiple departments and organisations to be trying to do the same thing at the same time.
Well, this is why I had made reference to the scrutiny role that this committee and other committees would have, and the explanatory memorandum with new or amended legislation that's passing through, that there would be an onus placed on those who are drafting the legislation to demonstrate very clearly in the memorandum how they have considered the implications of Article 2 and the compliance with the commitments contained in that article. So that is an absolute essential element to enable committees such as yourselves to be able to scrutinise legislation and satisfy yourselves that there has been consideration given to it. And if not, then to pass it back and say, well, we didn't do it. But in terms of the EU, what we have done is actually, as I said, in terms of the EU commitment to establishing a website whereby all proposals for legislative reform or change or introduction would be highlighted to enable us to identify them. And similarly, we're working with the TEO to ensure that the Assembly of Civil Servants will have that same arrangement. And similarly with Westminster. So it's still very much a work in progress to iron out the issues as to how such a process will work in reality. But it's something that we're very mindful of. Alison has already given clear voice to the fact that her resources are now so stretched that there are serious difficulties within her organisation. The rest of us are not too far behind her, but we do need to have a streamlined process whereby nothing falls between stools and we're all comfortable with the information that's being shared. So it's very much a work in progress, and we would ask you, this committee, to lend your voice to our call for civil servants to work with us, to have an explanatory memorandum that fully covers these issues. So, as we get more detail and more arrangements and agreements put in place, we will keep you appraised of them, but it's something that we are very, very mindful of.
Okay, thank you, Geraldine. That's been very clear. And I keep on saying one final thing, but this is my final question. Last week, this committee heard from the Centre of Cross-Border Studies in relation to the protocol and the engagement of civic society and the importance of that and the fact that it is, provided for within the protocol and the agreement. And when you addressed the Lords, you also talked about this civic engagement, and all commissioners today, as I said earlier, mentioned about communication and stakeholder and civic engagement. And quite a lot of our members would talk about the democratic deficit that we have here. How would you see that this is a way, and the frameworks that need to be put in place, but this is a way for wider engagement and the voice of our citizens to be heard, particularly in a rights-based context?
If I maybe just start and the others can come in behind me, but In all of the evidence that we have provided to the House of Lords and to other committees and stakeholders, we have been calling for a formal engagement process with civic society in Northern Ireland. We have raised the issue with the House of Lords, who in turn have raised it with the Secretary of State and Government. We have raised it with the EU delegation and again with the co-chair of the Joint Working Consultative Group. We believe that it's absolutely essential that both EU and UK government continue to engage with civic society in relation to the Article 2 commitment. That is something that we believe to be sacrosanct. We have called for more transparency in terms of the work of the Joint Consultative Working Group in relation to publicising their agenda in advance, to be able to inform civil society as to what they're going to be discussing and to afford the opportunity for information to be fed into that process. And we will continue to call for that. Alison or Sinead, do you want to add to that point?
All I was going to say in addition to that is that however you do it, however the formal mechanism for engagement is set up, it needs to be structured and transparent, as Geraldine has said. But what I would say is that to really achieve the purpose, for it to be engagement with a purpose, it should be focused on the practical issues. And engagement on the sort of the ideological or legal issues just doesn't really reach people at all. But practical issues really does. And you need to really reach into communities, not just those who represent them. If you can, I mean, it's not easy, but you really need to hear from people directly affected. And it's however you do it. If you follow that sort of approach, I think you will learn an awful lot. We're certainly learning an awful lot now. We're doing that.
And I would just echo the same. Participation is such a key pillar of both human rights and equality. And my mantra is nothing about us without us. And it has to be that meaningful participation. But however, which way you engage with civic society, rights holders, and those most affected by the issues at hand, it has to be a way in which they can really meaningfully participate and contribute to the decisions that affect their lives.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to the commissioners for your briefing this afternoon. It's been extremely informative, and we'll discuss the content of your briefing and the actions thereafter. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. I believe we don't have a quorum at the moment. So we can't really discuss actions. We're going to have to hear evidence from, and there's quite a number of actions that I would like to have follow through as a result of the briefing that we had from the commissioners. Very important actions as well. So we don't have a quorum at the moment, and hopefully we will. We perhaps will reach out. Will we reach out to other members to see if someone comes in later on?
We can continue to hear evidence.
Yeah.
We could discuss actions, but not make decisions about the actions.
Right. Okay. Are members happy for us to discuss several actions? Yeah. Okay. Well, one of the first actions, I'm quite concerned about what we have learned from the Human Rights Commissioner in relation to the accreditation and the status of the Commission itself. I think that that's really important for everybody in Northern Ireland, and so therefore I would suggest that we write to the Secretary of State in relation to ensuring that the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission is supported towards reaccreditation status and is given further funding support for their enhanced role in relation to their core work. In particular, obviously, we are in a very unique position here in Northern Ireland. We have an awful lot of work in relation to human rights, in relation to the protocol, and particularly the protection of human rights and equality in and around the Good Friday Agreement as well. So it's a very, very important role and it crossed many pathways. So I think that we should be writing to the Secretary of State and making that point to him. Anybody? Go ahead, Emma. Yeah.
Chair?
Oh, Christopher, yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, sorry, just while I was looking, I appreciate everyone's in the same boat in terms of funding and the situation that we're in, wanting funding. I looked up while the conversation was taking place, just to see for comparison, the Equality and Human Rights Commission in GB, which obviously covers England, Wales and Scotland. I'm sorry for that background noise, my printer's just sort of adjusting itself. It has a staff of 203 people and it covers a population of roughly 66 million. I recall asking these questions some time ago. We don't obviously have an Equality and Human Rights Commission. We have two commissions. We have an Equality one and we have the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. In terms of staffing numbers, I would be interested to see pro rata what the same level of staffing is here in comparison to the equality and human rights infrastructure that exists in GB. The reason I want just to know that is because I can predict that if we write to the Secretary of State, he will come back and point this out to us, that we actually, for a country of just under 2 million people, have a much more expansive infrastructure pro rata than a country of 66 million people would. By all means, if members want to send a letter saying, this representation has been made to us, but I think, frankly, it'll fall on deaf ears.
Well, I think with the urgency that is required in relation to the reaccreditation, we've heard it a plea very strongly from all three commissioners of the importance of this status and for the necessity for further funding. And I think it's important at this given time as well, when so much is going on and the work is piling up. As they have indicated. Now, the Human Rights Commission seem to be actually extremely busy but the other two commissioners are in a similar position, but not just quite with the urgency that is required. So I think it's important that we would write to the Secretary of State. And the second letter that I would suggest to the Secretary of State is to just raise the issue that we raised in relation to nationality and the Borders Bill, and the significance it would have to citizens living here on this island that travel to work across two different jurisdictions every single day, and just what that status is, and highlight our particular issues here on the island of Ireland. And I think that we should write to, as I say, the Secretary of State in relation to that as well. In relation to the CTA area, I think that that is a real concern for the common travel area. It's very much, there's nothing firm in legislation, and I think we've seen that really in particular around not just Brexit, obviously that really brought it into focus, but even around the pandemic and the rights based of travel between our two countries, north, south, east, west, west, east, etc., etc. And I think that the rights of people in our islands need to be protected in legislation. So I would suggest that we write a letter to the UK government and to the Irish government and ask them to consider, strengthening the rights of the common travel area and firm legislation that people know exactly where they stand in it. And I think that increasingly that is the way we have to go in relation to the protection of rights of people within our islands. So obviously I don't have a quorum to get that through, but those are three suggestions, and I wouldn't mind a conversation in and around them.
Chair.
We back those.
Sorry, Park, I think came in first. Emma, is that okay?
Go on ahead, Emma. No, I think Emma was on before me here.
No, it was purely just to say for the record I would support those recommendations. I mean, given the position of the North in terms of the fact that we have been brought out of the EU against the will of the people in the north, and the fact that we share a land border with an EU region and all the implications for residents here. It's that accreditation loss is a travesty, and we should be writing to ask about funding for that. And obviously the Equality Commission is a separate northern-based organisation that is an arm's length body of the Assembly as opposed to the British government. So their view in relation to funding for the Equality Commission is, I suppose, irrelevant.
And then my fourth action, and I suppose this is really to...
Sorry, can I just come back on that? It's perfectly relevant. If you're suggesting writing to the United Kingdom government, and it was you who raised the issue, if you're suggesting writing to the United Kingdom government to increase funding for an arm's length body to the Assembly, then it is perfectly relevant they will say. It's so obvious what they'll say.
Aye, the funding related to the Human Rights Commission, Christopher, as part of dedicated mechanism as a result of a protocol which we only have because of the British government's insistence that we're all dragged out of the EU. But your reference to the population of the UK and all of these other matters are completely irrelevant, given that the North is in a totally different position, and we have residents here and we have people here that have came from parts of the EU. Lost rates as a result of Brexit.
Relevant. The levels of funding that go to other parts of the United Kingdom for similar projects are absolutely relevant.
Sorry, can I bring Pádraig de Largy into the spotlight?
Chair, just to echo what Emma and yourself have both said there, that we totally back the recommendations and be more than happy to support those. We're in a post-conflict society. This is a totally different situation from Christopher, and I have to say, particularly around rights, I find it difficult that somebody who was prepared to block women's healthcare rights yesterday is going to come on now and discuss anything that was right.
And what we're saying now is relevant to the work of this committee.
Sorry, I have another fourth recommendation that is, or action that is relevant to the briefing that we just had, and that is, and I suppose, an ask of the clerks here that we get a summation of just some of the key issues so that we can feed that into the Executive Office so that they can take action as proposed by the three commissioners as well. If the clerk's okay, just a summation and get that submitted as well. So I think if everybody's happy enough, we'll move on to our next oral briefing. Okay, our next item of business is Centre for Children's Rights, and can I refer members to pages 55 to 437 of the meeting pack for the relevant papers, and I want to welcome to the meeting this afternoon Dr. Siobhan McAllister, Senior Lecturer, Centre for Children's Rights, Queen's University Belfast, and Dr. Mary Louise Carr, Lecturer of Centre for Children's Rights, Queen's University Belfast. Can I advise both of you that this session is not being recorded by Hansard, but a video of the meeting will be available on the committee webpage. And can I invite Siobhan and Mary Louise to brief members? And can I say just from the outset, your report and your documentation was stimulating to read, but also very, very sobering. The fact that we have a new generation of young people that are still being re-traumatised as a result of the conflict that we've experienced here. And I suppose never more so than if you listen to some of the committee contributions here, that you can see that the divisions in our society are very visible and very hurtful for all to see. So I'd be really interested in how we can overcome some of the difficulties and hear some of the recommendations that you've put forward. Thank you. I'll open up the floor now to Siobhan and Mary Louise.
Thank you, Chairperson, for the opportunity to present to the committee this afternoon. So as you say, I'm Dr. Mary Louise Carr from the Centre for Children's Rights, and I'm joined by my colleague today, Dr. Siobhan McAllister, also the Centre for Children's Rights. As you know, the report is quite large, so we will read from some notes today just to keep us focused and to time. So today we've been asked to brief the committee on the findings from our research report. It didn't end in 1998. The research was commissioned by the Commission for Victims and Survivors and funded by SEUPB Peace 4. Over 2 decades after the signing of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, this research engaged with multiple generations in areas across Northern Ireland and the border regions of Ireland most adversely affected by the conflict, and examined how the legacies of the past continue to impact children, young people, families and communities. Transgenerational legacy extends beyond psychological trauma and can include socioeconomic and structural legacies, in that children growing up in some communities are negatively affected by residual sectarianism, continued segregation and chronic underinvestment in their communities. As a result of the continued impacts of the conflict, many children and young people have had a number of their rights infringed or compromised, and the legacy of the conflict should therefore be understood as a significant children's rights issue. The project was grounded in a child rights-based approach, which embedded young people's participation in all stages of the project. As such, members of 2 young people's advisory groups were involved throughout the study, including in the design of questions and data collection instruments, the use of participatory methods to capture the views and experiences of children and young people, analysis of research findings, forming of research recommendations, and the production of a young person's research report just launched yesterday. The study focused on the continuing transgenerational impacts of the Troubles on the lives of children and young people and parents throughout Northern Ireland and the border region of Ireland. It adopted a 2-generation approach, exploring and identifying the experiences and needs of current generations of children and young people affected by the conflict's legacy and their relationships with older generations, many of whom experienced the worst years of the conflict. The study collected the views and experiences of 195 individuals across 7 research sites, including key stakeholders, community workers, youth workers, parents, and 104 children and young people aged 14 to 24. 7 research themes were identified, which are detailed in the report. The first 2 explore how children and young people learn about the past and how they learn about culture and identity. The remaining 4 themes examine the various ways in which the legacies of the conflict continue to impact on young people, families and communities in relation to divided space, health and well-being, parenting, family life and relationships, and so-called paramilitarism and policing. Today, we want to highlight just a few of the research findings across these themes. Of course, we have been selective and cannot cover the research in detail in this short presentation, so we welcome talking about some of the research findings in more detail through your questions. The first thing we would like to highlight is the passing of views and narratives down through generations and what this means for learning about the past, identity and culture. The views and attitudes held by parents, grandparents and other family members were strongly embedded in past experiences of the conflict, and many participants referenced some concern about the transmission of these to the current generation of young people. There was the potential for young people to adopt and act upon such narratives, which could manifest in the way they voted, them identifying difference, feeling fear or hatred towards the other community, thus having the potential to foster sectarian beliefs. A number of participants expressed concerns that such views could be entrenched at a young age prior to any formal learning about the past. The findings thus reinforce previous research and importantly highlight that these issues persist a number of years on. The findings also suggest that young people's views and beliefs are shaped by the divided nature of their communities, where visible signs of segregation in the community and segregated education had the potential to increase division by sending a message that communities should not interact. Participants noted that both visible demarcation and a segregated education system creates and reinforces barriers between young people of different communities and contributes to a heightened sense of difference, which could intensify feelings of fear and sectarianism. There was a concern, therefore, that by the stage that young people do get to meet and have the potential to integrate, the sense of difference could be too ingrained for meaningful interaction to occur. However, despite the continuity of experiences across generations in terms of attitudes towards the other community, the findings also reveal that the transmission of beliefs is not inevitable. Indeed, some young people demonstrated an ability to resist or challenge negative or sectarian attitudes when exposed to them, particularly when they are provided the safe space to voice their views and have their opinions heard in line with their rights under Article 12 of the UNCRC. For most of these young people, this safe space had been provided by good relations programmes where discussion was encouraged. Young people heard what they defined as neutral accounts. They were able to challenge narratives, have their voice heard, and in some cases, foster new relationships across communities. This type of learning was in contrast to what they described in a school context, where they identified a number of limitations. Young people noted that what was learned and the way in which it was learned depended on school, subject choices, teachers' views, and the capacity or willingness to engage young people in sensitive and potentially emotive discussions. Learning in school could therefore be, according to young people, selective, partial, lacking in depth, or absent. Most young people articulated strong views that learning about the past was important to know about the country's history, to acknowledge the impact on communities and families, to understand how the past shapes the present, and to learn from the past to inform the future. Attention should turn to how we can create safe spaces for children and young people to learn about the conflict, have these sensitive discussions, and feel able and safe to acknowledge and/or challenge narratives of the past. Given the learning evident across the generations as a result of the passing of stories through the community and family, learning should facilitate dialogue between the generations and build young people's capacity to interrogate stories in a safe place. Consultation with children and young people in the development of learning resources and methods is crucial to ensure that they are relevant and appropriate to children's interests and to ensure that their views are taken into account. I will pass on to Siobhan now, who will follow on with some further themes.
Thank you, Mary Louise, and thank you to the committee. I want to say a little about what the research revealed about the transgenerational impacts in relation to health and well-being, parenting and family life, and then a little about the legacies of violence. The research revealed that for many of the parent generation who grew up during the Troubles, childhood memories lie just below the surface, and many of these were revealed during interviews and focus groups. For some, childhood experiences were just being made sense of as adults, with memories and pains only recently realised or resurfaced as a result of conflict-related news stories, historical inquiries, or more openness within families. Young people today, therefore, may be faced with parental grief, anger, or hurt for the first time, or in particularly acute ways at particular times. And the impacts of this on family life and the ability to parent, and therefore on children's well-being, was discussed by many research participants, particularly in discussions of what some refer to as transgenerational trauma. The research suggests, therefore, that the outworkings and manifestations of conflict-related harm can be delayed, and that it may take considerable time before individuals seek or require help and support. Many parents had, like their own parents before them, avoided, buried, or minimalised their experiences, having emotionally regulated, locked away feelings, or not dealt with pain or loss over a number of years. As a community representative and parent explained, I probably would have locked all of that away and said that's in the past and forgot about it. But the more that I've been doing this job, then these memories have started to drip feed back in again, and I've started remembering more and more. The research adds to a body of evidence identifying silence and avoidance as a means of coping and a strategy employed by parents to avoid passing traumatic experiences to children, but also as something that could inadvertently be damaging and potentially generative. Members of both the parent generation and the current generation reflected on their family lives and talked of often sensing something being wrong despite the silence and avoidance of talking about issues. Silence and sensing had led to confusion, half-truths, heightened anxieties, and feelings of insecurity among children. Silence, therefore, acted in opposition to its intent to protect and stabilise. Indeed, a small number of young people whom we spoke with, while sensing that there was something going on with a parent or in their family, and noting that this impacted on their own well-being, also tried to hide the impact of this in order to protect their parent from further help. So we could see ways in which silence then could reproduce silence, with some parents identifying that it had filtered into their own parenting, and some young people noting that their generation were also reticent to talk about their problems. So while the research demonstrates that many are still impacted, as we've said, by the legacies of the conflict and violence, it also points to conflict-related violence as a feature of many communities today. Some families dealing with the pains of the past are also dealing with present-day fear, intimidation and violence within their communities. Detailed accounts of harms demonstrate through the research the range of ways in which children, young people and parents continue to experience coercive control. And while some young people spoke of an undercurrent of fear or unease within their communities, many others spoke of this as a normal part of their lives. As one young person said, "I think it's because we're used to it. It doesn't really bother us or nothing." Normalisation, avoidance and minimising the impacts of their experiences were ways of coping and managing violence. And we see very clearly that these were techniques that were very similar to the coping strategies used by their parents during the conflict. So this may therefore reflect coping strategies that have been passed down generationally. But that violence was normalised did not mean that it was accepted by communities or indeed by young people. Many in the research likened these groups to criminal gangs. They spoke of the damaging impacts they had on their communities, and many employed the language of child abuse, exploitation and grooming in describing how they preyed on and manipulated children and young people. And this is a significant finding, as this is somewhat different to research that was carried out in similar communities in transition around 10 years ago. However, a number of community representatives also spoke of an almost paralysis in dealing with the issue. Indeed, some noted a lack of support from the PSNI, social services and health, and of having to put themselves in vulnerable situations to protect and support young people and families. To conclude then, overall, the research demonstrates the various ways in which children and young people are still impacted by the past. Children and young people learn from those around them and are faced almost daily with a legacy case or issue within the media. Many also live, as Mary Louise said, deeply divided lives or experience coercive control in their communities. Recent events such as the shooting of Lyra McKee, the perceived implications of Brexit and high-profile historical inquiries demonstrated to the young people in this research that violence could erupt at any time, and hence the immediacy of threats to their safety. So we cannot and are not protecting young people by not engaging with these issues, because these issues are part of young people's lives. The research shows very clearly that young people have the capacity to talk about these very sensitive issues, and they have important views that need to inform decisions made about their lives and communities and the future of these islands. It is in learning and talking about the past that young people can understand it, engage with it, and indeed challenge and question the narratives and messages that may be passed down to them. We just want to conclude then with the words of one of the young people who was involved in the research, who said, "You can learn from the past as well, so I don't think there's a real reason to try to cover it up. If you look at what used to happen, you can figure out how to avoid it for the future. And if we don't learn about it, I don't think we know how to avoid it." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan and Mary Louise. I think it was a really important piece of research, and it certainly, I think there's a lot of cross-cutting themes in there, and dealing with legacy is a key role within the context of the Executive Office, and certainly from a scrutiny point of view, this committee. And I watched during the summer, or a few months back actually, the documentary that was commissioned by the BBC that Patrick Keelty led out, and it was just exploring the legacy and our culture, and it became really quite apparent through that programme about the transgenerational trauma that is experienced by our young people. And I don't know rightly if we as a committee and the Executive Office are actually addressing that particular area of our legacy. So just in that context, as I say, there's so much in the research itself, but and it crosses through, education, health, justice. You talk about the communities and transition programmes, about the victims and survivors, the coercive control of paramilitaries within our communities. I mean, there is a lot of content in that document. But have you, Siobhan, had a chance to look at the recommendations of the FIC report because I think, you know, when we're looking at the reports that this committee receives, I think that there's a duty of care that we really take into, you know, it's not good enough sitting in your hands and not acting on the recommendations, because we are actually dealing with another generation of young people that are being re-traumatised. And one of the things that Patrick Keelty said, you know, about his own experience in the Troubles was, you know, he thought, go away to England, create a new life, put a lid in it, don't talk about it, let's avoid it, and, you know, bury it and move forward. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen. The mental health issues that we have on the ground here in Northern Ireland, you know, there is a clear correlation to our past and the trauma and the inability to deal with it, be it from our parents or be it from, and I'm the parent now, I suppose, but, you know, our new generation of young people. I think that, you know, and even we've had a pivotal report today in our correspondence that talks about people choosing to leave here to try and get as much distance between here and that's part of the past. They want to leave the orange and green sectarian politics behind because they feel traumatised by that. Is there any way, you know, obviously through that research that you've done, you've looked at all of these reports and recommendations. What can you see as the provisions that we would put in place in order to deliver positive outcomes for our young people in dealing with the things that actually are now disturbing their mental health and their mental well-being? That's a very long, that was a statement rather than...
Well, I'll maybe start just by picking up on a couple of the things that you said there. I think what comes out very clearly from the research is that avoiding the issues and not talking about them hasn't done any good in the past and is not going to do any good currently, and that young people actually are very able to talk about these things. In terms of the mental health impacts, it was perhaps one of the issues that young people spoke about most was the lack of appropriate supports and accessible child and adolescent mental health supports in Northern Ireland and in the cross-border areas as well. So young people spoke in detail, for example, about long waiting lists, about being sent home from hospital when they were experiencing crises. And what we would find then is that often it was left to communities to pick up the pieces and to deal with the very issues that they didn't have the resources to deal with. So I'm sure you're aware of the NICI research recently, which has looked at the child and adolescent mental health services and argued how those aren't fit for purpose and how they're not meeting children's rights to adequate healthcare. So clearly there's a huge piece of work to be done there in terms of our services and supports. And as you say, recognising that we are a society transitioning out of conflict and that as a result of that, there is a lot of mental health impacts that are maybe only beginning to surface now. So we also need to be forward thinking in terms of thinking that we're possibly going to need more supports and more services in the future for families and for children and young people, and potentially also for the issue of transgenerational trauma. I think, as you say, it's quite a new issue. Perhaps 10 years ago in some similar research, it was talked about fleetingly, but actually many people talked about transgenerational trauma, including children and young people within this research. So there seemed to be a real understanding that we need to understand what this is better, that those working with children and young people and those in mental health services need to be looking for this and recognising it, and that there need to be clear supports for this. And I guess that the regional trauma network is one response to that, but we need to ensure that there's clear pathways whereby children and young people and families can be referred on to that, because this research also very clearly showed that many of those that we would spoke to don't necessarily define themselves as victims or engage with victim services, and we didn't recruit very many people involved in the research through victim services. So there has to be routes into generic services when we don't necessarily, well, we're not necessarily defining or understanding the issues people are experiencing as being a result of conflict legacy.
Okay. To what extent do you believe that the non-implementation of the legacy aspects of the New Decade New Approach impact on children?
Louise, do you want me to pick up on that one as well? So I guess, in some respects, we can only speak to what the research shows, and some of the issues around legacy weren't necessarily explored with children and young people within the research. What was clear is, again, going back to this point that not dealing with issues in the past, silencing, avoiding things, hasn't been beneficial for us as a society. It hasn't been beneficial for communities, and it hasn't been beneficial for families. So we could certainly, I think, take the view from the research that there is not a desire to not deal with the past and to not deal with legacy issues. And if we want to deal with even issues around mental health, we need to deal with legacy issues. Dealing with mental health is not just, about more mental health services. Indeed, one of the issues raised within the research was about the over-medicalisation of trauma and mental health in the past, but actually we need to deal with these larger issues around, the ongoing impact of paramilitarism within communities, divided societies, the search for truth and justice, and so that we need to actually deal with everything.
Yeah, and I know, speaking from my own constituency, we have, very, very, very large masses of our population that have mental health issues, and there is a correlation, as I say, with the history of our past, and we need to deal with it. So can I bring Emma Sheeran into the spotlight, please? Thank you.
I'm not sure if you...
Yeah, can he? Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. There was just a wee delay on my buttons there, and thanks very much to Siobhan and Mary Louise for the presentation and for the questions that you have answered already. I've alluded earlier today to the impact on the North, on the fact that we don't have a Bill of Rights here, and during the Bill of Rights process, I chair the ad hoc committee, we received presentations around the impact of intergenerational trauma from the conflict here and the particular impact on children and young people. And I suppose you've reiterated everything that we had been told during those presentations in your findings and from your report today. And I suppose we know that the conflict here had the most impact on areas of high deprivation, low income. There we can see those are the areas that suffer the most from addiction and mental health issues, and as has already been alluded to, that intergenerational trauma. And oftentimes socioeconomic rights are I suppose, linked to fixing those problems or addressing them. And I just wondered if you would agree that a Bill of Rights that had a proper, robust housing, healthcare, education rights framework built into it would have a significant role in reducing the impact of the conflict here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come in first, and Mary Louise, if you want to come in. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that click came through very, very clearly in the research, is that if we look at the communities that are experiencing, high levels of mental ill health, high levels of suicide, for example, there's that overlayer of the impact of the conflict and deprivation and lack of investment and poor services. So again, responses can't just be mental health responses. They need to be wider responses, and the same goes for the issue around the continued presence and activity and impact of so-called paramilitaries. It's also within the same communities, and to respond to those issues, we're not just responding through programmes directed towards particular groups. We don't just need a response around policing and justice. We need those more systemic, holistic responses that respond to the lack of opportunities, for example, for young people within those areas, and the histories of lack of legitimacy in the police. So these are much broader issues, which I think is why, in some respects, the report is so big and the recommendations are so broad. In some respects, is because they're so cross-cutting. And if you don't mind, I would just also come back to the issue of trauma. We do talk a lot about transgenerational trauma and intergenerational trauma. I think we also have to recognise that, as we've alluded to, there is a new generation of victims being created within many communities at the minute because of the abuse and the harms being perpetrated on them by so-called criminal groups. And while we might know something about the physical impacts of that on children and young people, we know very little actually about the mental health impacts of children and of that on children and young people. So these children and young people are going to go on then to be the next generation of parents. So if we're talking about transgenerational trauma, already, we need to again think forward about how this could impact on future generations as well. And I have some concerns there in terms of, who's picking up these young people in terms of mental health services. Certainly, again, we get the impression from the community representatives that we speak with that these issues really aren't being dealt with at all. And I don't know if a regional trauma network has the ability to pick up on those. Mary-Louise, did you want to come in on anything?
Maybe just to add, Siobhan, as well, just to go back to the point about the cross-cutting issues in terms of poverty and socioeconomic context in areas of high deprivation, housing, healthcare, etc. And yes, absolutely, the report and the recommendations really do need to be taken as a whole, and we would caution against kind of choosing recommendations for specific departments, as they all are interconnected. So this really does need to be considered as a whole, and that responsibility lies across the executive to address the various impacts of conflict legacy on certain young people that have been highlighted in the report.
Just on that issue, Mary-Louise and Siobhan, have you submitted this report? I know you say you want it to be looked at on the whole, but have you submitted it to the Department for Education? Have you submitted it to the Department for Communities? Because there's significant areas, and the Department of Health, and there's significant areas in the research that actually cross all of those departments.
Well, as part of the research, we did have research advisory committees that were members were selected by the Commission for Victims and Survivors who commissioned the research, and there were representatives from departments on that, so who would be familiar with the report and the findings. But yes, there are, I suppose, whilst recommendations are relevant across departments, there probably are some recommendations which naturally lie with some departments. So, for example, we can see some relevance for the independent review of education at the moment in relation to how children learn about the conflict and about the past in school. And some of the things that the findings are highlighting here is that we need to consider, for example, at what age is most appropriate for children to start learning about the past, particularly keeping in mind that this needs to happen before negative attitudes may be ingrained. We also need to think about where in the curriculum we might place learning about the past, to ensure that this is a space which allows for discussion and debate, rather than maybe learning which is focused towards exams and outcomes like that, which children and young people felt wasn't particularly helpful. And we also need to think more about what it is that children are learning about the past, and particularly a need to understand their culture and others' culture and identity, and the importance of that for their own community and all communities, and also about developing a language around culture and identity, which is perhaps new and not divisive. And also in relation to like how they learn about the past in terms of the methods and activities that are used, which are interactive for children and young people and meaningful for them. And really throughout this, what the report would suggest that consultation with children and young people themselves is absolutely crucial. In line with the rights of Article 12 of the UNCRC, children should be consulted on all matters that affect them, and that their opinions should be heard, so that in any developments across policy arenas, that consultation with children and young people are absolutely vital, so that they do have an input into their future and the future of their communities.
Some of the recommendations that you have made actually are quite similar to the recommendations in the FIC report as well. It's about how we learn about our past, how we discuss our past, how we engage with each other's culture and identity, and the level of acceptance of diversity within our communities. There is really strong correlation there. So I mean, one of the recommendations that I will be making to our committee is that we invite the junior ministers to engage with your research paper in order to find pathways and an action plan in around the FIC report as well, because I think that it's quite intuitive really in some of the responses and the recommendations, and the voice of children, they're really very much centric in the essence of your report. And as you say, it's how do we deal with the new generation, the generation that's experiencing trauma today as a result of our inability to deal with our past. We need to find a solution and a pathway through it. So no other members have indicated a desire to question. If they do, they raise their voices now or forever lose their place. No. Okay, so at that, Siobhan and Mary Louise, thank you very much for your briefing to the committee this afternoon. It was insightful, and we will be passing a recommendation to the junior ministers to look closely at your recommendations as they find a pathway in working with legacy and transgenerational trauma. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you.
Okay. Everyone, will you be happy enough? I suppose, again, we don't have a quorum, but my recommendation is that, because of the cross-cutting theme of this report, that we invite the junior ministers to engage with it as part of the programme around flags, identity, and emblems, etc., and perhaps it can be formed part of an action plan the way through in relation to particularly some of the education pieces that and the mental health issues that that Siobhan and Mary Louise have raised. Okay. And can I refer members to correspondence from Pivotal as well, just on the basis of that discussion that we had? We had a report. It's in correspondence on pages 1100 to 119, the meeting pack, which reports the conflict legacy considerations in relation to young talent leaving Northern Ireland. The correspondence from the Independent Reporting Commission on pages 940 to 1062 of the meeting pack, which makes a number of recommendations as well in relation to tackling paramilitarism, including the impact on women in particular, and our witnesses raised that as well. Members, there are significant linkages and aspects of these of the legacy across the evidence that the committee is receiving. This is going to be this being a large area of inquiry, and there being limited committee time in the time ahead and towards the end of the mandate, can I suggest to members, in light of the significant theme for the legacy report, to recommend to the successor that the committee picks this up So each committee is tasked with providing a legacy report in which we detail some areas of work that we think that the new mandate should pick up, and I think that there is a really significant legacy piece when you bring all of these research documents into play that the next committee should be looking at in detail, and it's really unfortunate when I see some of the stuff that's coming in, really good research that requires time and scrutiny and effort to get to the bottom of some of the major issues. It's just regrettable that we have such a short period of time, but in our legacy report I think we should point in the direction of greater scrutiny and bringing these large pieces of work together. So if members were happy enough, that is a suggestion that I'm going to make to the committee clerk in terms of a legacy report. Any comments? Okay. So item number 7, in our agenda is the COSICA briefing from the Historical Institute of Abuse. Can I refer members to pages 438 and 460 of the meeting pack for the relevant papers? And can I welcome into the spotlight Fiona Ryan, Commissioner for Survivors of the Institutional Childhood Abuse. And can I advise you, Fiona, that this session is not being recorded by Hansard, but a video of the meeting will be available on the committee webpage. Fiona, you're very welcome to our committee this afternoon. And can I just ask you to give us a briefing and an update and detail your recommendations? Obviously, the committee received a paper from you 2 weeks ago where you outlined just your work to date and several recommendations going forward and what you wanted to achieve in the short term. So if you could just talk us through all of that.
Good afternoon, Chair, and thank you so much for the opportunity to appear before this committee again. I'm grateful for this committee's interest in our work and in the wider issue of historic and institutional childhood abuse. My intention, as you say, is to provide an overview of the work that my office has undertaken in the past year. We celebrated our first anniversary on the 14th of December, and I'd like to tell you about some of the general issues that we've noted in relation to historic and institutional childhood abuse before proceeding on to discuss the matter of public apology, which the committee asked me to provide a briefing on sometime in November. I guess before I start, I just want to remark that I'm very, very struck by your previous speakers and the remarks they made regarding legacy and transgenerational trauma. My colleagues attended the seminar this morning, and I think what we all felt was that there were significant learnings from that research, and we would certainly like to follow up on those, but that some of the findings had real resonance for us based on our own experiences. As an office, my first priority is to thank survivor representatives for their time and their expertise and their generosity and their patience with sharing their own experiences and knowledge with me since I took up post as Commissioner, like I said, a year ago. I said at the time of taking up post, becoming Commissioner, that it was a privilege to take on this role and to represent the interests of survivors. A year on, I've had the opportunity to meet with survivors directly, and that privilege, that sense of privilege of being able to represent their interests has only grown. I guess it's one thing to come into a role and to think that you are very lucky to be given this opportunity, but it's another to actually meet with survivors and hear from them about their lived reality, not only of their experiences, but of the impact of the abuse and how it's shaped their lives, and not just their lives, and this is referring again to your previous speakers, but also their families, and particularly the impact it has had on spouses, children, and I suppose to just honour that and the fact that they have shared those experiences with me. I made engagement a priority on taking up post, and certainly we have worked hard to engage directly with survivors, but also service providers, both specific and service providers of generic services or general services. I think we would obviously have liked to have increased that engagement or developed that engagement even further. I'm hoping in the new year that we can actually reach out to survivors, particularly in Britain, in order to hear more of their experiences. I want to thank those individual survivors who've engaged with my office over the past year. We've had over 519 separate queries since we started on the 14th of December, approximately 50% of those relating to redress and the applying for redress. I'm sure the committee is aware that my office has a responsibility under legislation to provide general information and advice in relation to redress. We do that in person. Over the phone, we also separately provide information on applying for redress via our website, www.cosica-ni.org, where we list the most frequently asked redress questions and set them out as clearly as we can. And they're very much based on the queries that my office have received. We obviously reached out to the Redress Board in order to understand more what's going on for them in light of obviously speaking to the committee. And so far the board has received over 2,199 applications, with 1,663 having been considered by a panel. In relation to services, while my office doesn't directly provide services, we do signpost services to appropriate we signpost survivors to appropriate services when they contact us in person. We also list those services on our website. And our aim is to basically create as much awareness for survivors of the services that are there for them and to put them in touch where possible. To date, the Victims and Survivors Service has engaged with 439 survivors of historic and institutional childhood abuse since they started on the 1st of December. And I think it's worth noting that for the VSS and for survivors, that for the individual survivors engaging with services, that they often require and look for more than one intervention. So for example, while they have engaged with 439 services, they provided over 600 counselling interventions. Obviously, they are looking to increase their services as they go forward, but that's where they're at a year on. And I know that they are very much engaged with their community partners as well in terms of delivering services. And we had the opportunity to visit with their community partners ways in terms of meeting their team, hearing from their team what survivors are actually saying to them, what survivors' needs are. And we had the opportunity to go to their new centre in Clough near Downpatrick, which was really, really useful to hear. I'm sure the committee would find this itself, that there's no substitute from hearing from both survivors directly and obviously from service providers themselves. I suppose a year on, we're looking as an office about how we can do better, and our intention going forward is certainly to reach out to survivors and ask, what can we do better? How can we best meet needs? One of the gaps that survivors have highlighted for us is around communications and the need to raise awareness of services, the need to raise awareness of redress, the need to raise awareness of my own office. I recognise that we need to do more to increase awareness, and I've been raising the need for that with the Executive Office and the need to primarily provide an integrated awareness raising campaign that reaches out not only to survivors here in Northern Ireland, but also in Britain and in the Republic of Ireland. I further advise the Executive Office to consider and implement this campaign as a priority in order to publicise redress services and our office. And I've been told by the Executive Office in response that it has started scoping the publicity campaign and will be focusing on it in the new year. I look forward to working in partnership with the office and with other stakeholders to move this forward further and to actually increase awareness among survivors of what's there. Like as I said, in the meantime, we're seeking to increase our own communications capacity, both here and in other jurisdictions. And we're in the process, for example, of reaching out to the Irish centres in Britain. We're doing this in recognition of the fact that 1 in 8 applications to redress are from survivors based in Britain. 1 in 6 of survivor contacts with VSS are from survivors in Britain. I think a very real case in point emerged the day before yesterday, where it was announced that redress awards in Britain would be disregarded in the context of benefits assessment. Under the legislation, they had been disregarded in Northern Ireland, but survivor representatives had been raising the issue and communicating their concerns with the committee, the Executive Office, the Secretary of State, and the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, that this was not the situation in Britain. I raised this issue with the committee on the 21st of April and followed up by writing to the Secretary of State as well. I suppose I'd like to congratulate the survivor representative groups who have been campaigning on this issue consistently and express thanks to the officials who succeeded in achieving the legislative solution. The news has just come through, and I'm glad the situation appears to be resolved in time for survivors and is due to take place in January. I think it does, however, again, underline the need to create awareness with survivors in Britain of this disregard and the fact that it's there, but also what issues of wider awareness. And I've said this previously to the committee, whereby I raised the issue of lack of research being carried out with survivors, particularly regarding their needs, but also on a population health basis. Where are survivors? We, at the moment, are in guesstimate territory. We know that a majority of survivors are probably still based around Derry and Belfast and in Northern Ireland. But I think from the point of view of creating awareness, of reaching out, of understanding what their needs are, there needs to be a solid piece of research undertaken. To that end, we are looking at engaging with the Public Health Agency in the new year to scope out how we could potentially look with other stakeholders and other partners in taking forward that research. The committee asked me before coming here to provide my views in relation to a public apology as recommended by the inquiry into historical institutional childhood abuse. For context, it's worth remembering that it is 5 years since the Historical Institution Abuse Inquiry was published on the 20th of January in 2017. I'd urge all of us to consider and reflect on the significance and symbolism of the upcoming 5th anniversary of the inquiry's report. Almost 5 years on, it's important to take stock of what has been done and what is outstanding from the inquiry's recommendations, including apology, memorial, and contributions, financial contributions by the institutions to the cost of redress and specialist services. And I think we need to consider how we can go forward to undertake the actions needed to make the most difference to survivors. As noted in my briefing to you on the 18th of November, the inquiry itself noted that there were mixed views regarding the apology. And I think it's worth us looking, and just revisiting the different perspectives. The inquiry said at the time that some survivors firmly demanded an apology, others equally firmly saying they saw no point or would not accept one if it was given. Nonetheless, the inquiry acknowledged that even with this spectrum of views, that they were recommending that the Northern Ireland Executive and those responsible for each of the institutions investigated where systemic failings were found should make a public apology in a single occasion at a suitable venue. The inquiry saw the value of apology as a formal recognition by government, a public authority or institution that they or their predecessors had made mistakes in the care and the way they had treated children they were responsible for. I think while we're looking at this whole issue of official recommendations, that we need to be aware of the importance of an apology to survivors and the impact that it can have. I think it's fair to say that even from my experience, even those survivors whom I've engaged with who've said to me that they don't regard the apology as personally important to them, they recognise its symbolic importance to other survivors. But there are a significant number of survivors whom I've spoken to who have said to me, all I want to hear is I'm sorry. All I want to hear is that you were never to blame. And I think we need to recognise the importance of that to survivors, and that for many it is important for their sense of closure. I know she won't mind me mentioning it, but before I came on this call, a survivor representative reached out to me, and she's someone who has campaigned significantly in relation to apology. And she said to me, it was about acknowledgement, it was about saying sorry, and she referenced her own brother's experiences and how he had recently been through a court case, and I know she won't mind me mentioning her name. Her name is Margaret McGuckin, and her brother is Kevin. And she said, For him, his whole life has been shaped by his abuse experiences. And that the importance of hearing sorry can't be overestimated for him. I think in that context, we need to be aware of the fact that many survivors have passed before they've heard the words, "I'm sorry." I recently attended a reunion of the Rosetta Trust members, and the first thing we did was a minute's silence for those survivors who had passed. 6 had passed since they had last met. And I think we need to be aware of that in the midst of these official recommendations, that this is about people. This is about survivors. It's about their lives. It's about acknowledging what happened to them. It's about the state and the institutions being accountable. I think it's also worth remembering that these recommendations are significantly overdue. That 6 months after the inquiry report in 2017, Sir Anthony Hart told the Assembly at the time, and I'm going to read out his words, "The implementation of our recommendations is urgent because so many of those who waited many years for their voices to be heard and who anxiously await the implementation of our recommendations are now advancing in years or in poor health. And for them, the prospect of more delay adds to the burden so many have carried for so long." Coming close to the 5th anniversary of the inquiry's report, I think it's fair to say that anyone looking at the legacy of the inquiry would have to say there have been significant delays in implementing these recommendations. And not only have there been delays, but I would suggest that the relationship between the different recommendations could have been more fully understood in terms of prioritising and sequencing and the interdependencies of the different constituent elements in terms of an overall programme in response to historical institutional childhood abuse. The observation around sequencing and prioritisation is important, and we've seen it impact in terms of the apology and its relationship to the proposed review of the redress process. As I just stated, and as I stated previously to this committee and to the Executive Office, my view from engaging with survivor representatives and survivors has not been a question of apology. As I've said, for those survivors for whom apology is not personally responsible or important to them, they recognise that the apology is important to other survivors, that there is a recognition that it is meaningful, symbolic, and necessary to the closure for many survivors. The issue has been for survivors where they have questioned timing is that the review of the redress process takes place in advance of the apology because they view it as a matter of accountability. So fundamentally, there has been a spectrum of views in relation to apology, where you have survivors who regard it as separate and independent to any review of the redress process. You have survivors who view the redress process as needing to take place in advance of the apology, for the apology to be authentic and meaningful since it goes directly to state accountability. And then you have survivors for whom, as I've said previously, the apology is not a matter of importance, but they do recognise it as important for other people. It has consistently been my view as Commissioner, which I've put to the Executive Office, that the review of the redress process should be progressed in parallel with preparations for the full public apology, with resources allocated appropriately in recognition of the urgent nature of these matters. Victims have waited long enough, and it's incumbent upon the Executive to deliver on these commitments. I welcome, therefore, the announcement that the review of the redress process is now underway. As the review takes place, it's imperative that the Executive ensures that it is comprehensive and proceeds with urgency. Survivors have had to wait far too long to have their voices heard and to receive long-awaited recommendations set out in the historic institution abuse inquiry nearly 5 years ago. Many are now advancing in years, some in poor health, and the time is very much of the essence. I've spoken of my own personal experiences of engaging with survivors and hearing from survivor representatives, not only the experiences of survivors whom they're supporting, but also in their own personal lives. Again, I would underline to this committee that the 20th of January marks the 5th anniversary of the report into the inquiry into historical institutional abuse. And for many victims and survivors, this is a symbolic date. And I'm asked the Executive Office to consider the significance of this date. Survivors need a date. They need a timeline. And not just the survivors, services also need a date, whether unintended or not. And we understand that in the nature of these issues, there is unintended trauma and consequences. The reality is services could experience an increase in demand from survivors, and it will be prudent to consider the need for additional resources in response to a potential increase in demand for services, and not just for those specialist services, but also for those general services, particularly the mental health services. I have engaged with the mental health services, and we put in a consultation, we put in a submission in relation to the mental health consultation back in February. Again, I'm very conscious of the comments from your previous speakers and would echo those in relation to this issue as well. I'd also suggest that while the apology is important to many for closure, we need to remember that it is coming too late for others, and particularly those who have passed, and their memory needs to be acknowledged. There is also an opportunity for survivors to come forward if they choose to, and I think we always need to remember the fact that this is a choice for survivors, and that there is an opportunity through the apology to create awareness around redress, to create awareness around services for help, support and advocacy in relation to my own office. We also need to be aware of the fact that there are outstanding recommendations from the inquiry, including contributions by institutions to the cost of redress and specialist services. I welcome the appointment of the independent facilitator, Paul Sweeney. My office has been engaging with Paul and survivor representative groups in order that survivor views on this issue can be incorporated into his overall report to the executive. And I suppose finally, another outstanding issue is that of memorial. Again, the inquiry noted that there were a spectrum of views. This is a very complex and sensitive issue, but on balance, the inquiry recommended that a memorial be undertaken. In the context of historic institutional childhood abuse, a memorial forms part of the symbolic reparation by the state. It should therefore be viewed as part of the state's expression of recognition, justice and accountability for abuse. I would observe that again, time has been lost in implementing this recommendation, that initial discussions were commenced in 2017, but that process stopped. I recently met with the Arts Council of Northern Ireland in terms of understanding how this recommendation could be taken forward. I want to thank the committee for its time. I particularly want to thank the survivor representatives for again sharing with me their experiences, and those of individual survivors who have trusted my office to take forward their queries and shared with me their experiences. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for your briefing this afternoon. I now have to make an apology to you because we have lost our quorum here, and as a result of losing the quorum, we're going to have to suspend our business today without actually asking you any questions. I had a lot of questions to ask. I wanted to talk about apology, I wanted to talk about redress, I wanted to talk about communication and perhaps the failure in communication from the department's perspective. I wanted to talk about the victim-centric services, awareness raising and the outstanding recommendations that haven't been fulfilled yet. And I also wanted to talk about memorials. Unfortunately, I can't talk about any of those things this afternoon, as we haven't had a quorum now for quite a while during your presentation. But I wanted your words to be heard and to be on public view. So I can't go into any detailed questions at this stage. But you have made your points and you've done them as you always do, with significant empathy for the people that you represent and the voice of in many ways. So I want to thank you, Fiona, and I apologise on behalf of the committee. It wasn't the briefing and the questioning that I would have wanted, but we will review it again in the new year.
Thank you so much, Chair, for the opportunity. And obviously, we're available to yourself, the Vice Chair, and any committee members should they wish to follow up with us on any aspects contained within this briefing, or indeed anyone else who's listening in on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can I bring the two committee members into the spotlight?
Chair, Sorry, Emma, you want to go ahead or?
Okay, no, go ahead, Christopher, go ahead.
Sorry, just to say, I agree with what you said in terms of, I think it would be important, there's a lot of issues here that we should be working through, and I think it is important if we could put that as an agenda item very early once we're back in the new year, because I mean, I've been involved with these issues and working on these issues now ever since I've become an Assembly member. You know, I've served on this committee for 5 years now, and roundabout, as was said in the presentation, you know, we got the Hart report roundabout 5 years ago. So I think it's important that we really do need to be cracking on and delivering on the various recommendations that have been made over the course of time. But it's important, I think, that we do bring Fiona back when we have a full quorum in order to have a more full conversation with her.
Okay, sorry, Emma, into the spotlight.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wanted to ask some questions around apology as well, particularly. So it's kind of disappointing that we'd had that really good presentation and haven't been able then to ask any questions, and would concur with Christopher's request that we can look at this as soon as possible in the new year.
As Fiona said, times of the urgency, and they are reaching a significant milestone on the 20th of January. I really would have liked to have been send a letter to the Executive Office and ask them to proceed with urgency. We've got a letter from the Department today in relation to the redress programme and the terms of reference from it. But as I say, there's lots of questions, no answers, and we've got to suspend this committee meeting as of now. There's lots of business that we have in correspondence, but my only other item of business before we suspend this is to wish those members that are with us a very, very happy Christmas, and I hope you and your families enjoy this special time. And I want to thank the support of our committee clerks here, our committee clerk and the team. They're just amazing, and they work extremely hard in ensuring that this committee is well briefed, and they thoroughly go through every item of business and make sure that any action that we direct is followed up. So I want to wish them a very happy Christmas as well, and I hope they enjoy every moment of their break. They deserve it. Okay, thank you very much. Our next meeting is on Wednesday the 12th of January at 2 p.m. and it's here in this room and virtually. Thank you very much.
Happy Christmas, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
That was a bit disappointing.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30.